She cried for help. She begged strangers to save her husband, and on camera, it looked like the panic of a wife watching her world collapse on the rocks of the East Pass jetty. But later, when investigators slowed that footage down frame by frame, one small detail in the background changed everything. A glance, a gesture, a movement that didn't match the story she and her son gave. It wasn't enough to name a killer, but it was enough to make detectives ask the question nobody dared speak out loud. Were those the cries of a desperate wife, or the cries of someone hoping the rescue came too late? Who was really responsible for what happened that morning? And why would anyone want this man gone? What did the camera capture that the family never mentioned? To understand what that footage revealed, we have to go back to Savannah, before the jetty, before the panic, before the cameras, where the first crack in this family appeared. David's name might not make headlines, but what he represented matters more than any name ever could. A father who refused to give up.
5:30, we're north of the alleyway, 53rd Street, mark emergency assigned.
He was born in 1971 in a small town just outside Savannah, Georgia, the second of 4 children raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a textile factory. His childhood was modest in ways most Americans would recognize. Hand-me-down clothes, shared bedrooms, and government cheese stretched into meals that somehow always felt like enough. But his mother instilled something in him that money could never buy. The belief that family was everything, that you never abandoned the people who depended on you. David dropped out of high school at 17 when his mother's health declined, and someone needed to help keep the lights on for his younger siblings. He worked construction, landscaping, anything that paid. By 22, he had earned his GED through night classes. By 25, he secured a union position at a warehouse distribution center in Savannah, a job with benefits, stability, and a future. His supervisor later remembered him as the guy who never called in sick and never left a job half-finished. In 1998, David married his high school sweetheart. They were young and hopeful, convinced love would be enough. Their son Tyler was born in January 2001, a boy David adored from the first moment he held him. He stared at that baby like he couldn't believe something that perfect belonged to him, a family friend recalled. For a few years, the family seemed stable, but by 2006, the marriage had fractured beyond repair. His wife struggled with addiction, arguments echoed through their home, and reconciliations never lasted. In 2007, the divorce was finalized. And in a court system that overwhelmingly favored mothers, something remarkable happened. She left. David stayed. He was awarded full custody of 6-year-old Tyler. So there he was, at 36, a single father working 50-hour weeks, raising a child alone. He coached Tyler's little league team on Saturdays, helped with homework after exhausting shifts, and never missed a school play or birthday. His co-workers called him quiet, but dependable. His neighbors called him the good one on the block. Tyler looked at his father like he hung the moon. But single fatherhood is lonely. And loneliness makes people vulnerable to exactly the wrong kind of love. If you want to see how that vulnerability was exploited, stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. Angela was born in 1982 in Brunswick, Georgia, a coastal town about 80 miles south of Savannah, where shrimp boats lined the harbor and everyone knew everyone else's business. Her childhood looked comfortable from the outside, a 2-story house in a decent neighborhood, parents who held steady jobs, and clothes that were always new rather than borrowed. But behind closed doors, the warmth was missing. Her parents divorced when she was 9, a bitter split that divided the household and left Angela caught in the middle of 2 people who seemed more interested in hurting each other than raising her. Her mother remarried twice before Angela finished middle school, and her biological father drifted away entirely by the time she turned 14, becoming little more than a signature on occasional birthday cards that arrived late or not at all. She learned early that men were temporary, that their promises meant nothing, but their resources could be leveraged if you played your cards right. By her early 20s, Angela had developed a pattern that friends and former boyfriends would later describe to investigators with remarkable consistency. She dated men who could provide, older men with established careers, men who mistook her attention for genuine affection, men who never noticed that she always seemed to leave relationships with more than she came in with. A car here, a paid-off credit card there, a lease in her name on an apartment someone else funded. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only man in the world, one ex-boyfriend told detectives. And then one day you'd realize your savings account was empty, and she was already gone. In 2011, Angela was 29 years old and working as a receptionist at a medical billing company in Savannah when she attended a church cookout that would change multiple lives forever. A mutual friend introduced her to David, a 40-year-old warehouse worker with calloused hands and kind eyes who talked about his son Tyler with a pride most men reserved for sports cars or career accomplishments. Angela noticed something else that afternoon, details she filed away while smiling and laughing at his jokes. David owned his home outright. He had a union job with excellent benefits, and through casual conversation, she learned he carried a life insurance policy worth over $1 million, standard coverage for workers in hazardous warehouse environments. She had found her next target, but what Angela was planning went far beyond anything she had done before. Before you continue this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because what she did next will leave you speechless. Their courtship moved with a speed that should have raised red flags, but David was too grateful for the attention to notice the warning signs. Within 3 months of that church cookout, Angela had met Tyler, then 10 years old, and cautiously curious about the woman who made his father smile again. Within 6 months, she had moved into David's modest home on Whitfield Street, her belongings filling closets, and her presence filling the silence that had haunted the house since the divorce. By April 2012, they were married in a small ceremony at the same church where they had first met, surrounded by co-workers and neighbors who remarked how perfect they seemed together, how lucky David was to have found someone willing to take on a single father and his child. David believed he had finally caught a break, that the universe was rewarding him for years of sacrifice and struggle. His co-workers at the warehouse noticed the change immediately, the way he smiled more freely, talked about weekend plans and family dinners, carried himself like a man who had finally found solid ground after years of treading water. He brought her to the company Christmas party that year, a former colleague recalled. He couldn't stop introducing her to everyone. You could tell he was proud, like he wanted the whole world to see that somebody had chosen him. Angela played her role flawlessly, charming his friends, remembering co-workers' names, asking thoughtful questions that made everyone feel seen and appreciated. But perfection is exhausting to maintain, and within a year, the cracks began to show in ways only David could see. Angela complained about the house being too small, too old, too far from the restaurants and shopping she preferred. She complained about his hours at the warehouse, the unpredictability of overtime shifts, the exhaustion that left him drained on weekends. And she complained about Tyler, his neediness, his attachment to his father, the way he seemed to watch her with eyes that trusted nothing. David absorbed every complaint like a sponge, convinced that if he just worked harder, earned more, gave more of himself, she would eventually be satisfied. By late 2013, Angela had convinced David to increase his life insurance policy to $1.2 million. She framed it as protection for their future together. He signed without hesitation, never suspecting that he had just made himself worth more dead than alive. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, you need to understand Tyler, because without him, Angela's plan would have remained nothing more than a fantasy locked inside her head. In 2013, Tyler was 12 years old, caught in that fragile space between childhood and adolescence where identity feels like wet clay waiting for someone to shape it. His biological mother had abandoned him, leaving behind questions he couldn't answer and wounds he couldn't name. His father loved him deeply, but was stretched thin between warehouse shifts and household responsibilities, often too exhausted to notice the quiet battles his son was fighting alone. And now there was Angela, this new woman in their home who seemed to see him in ways no one else did. She was strategic from the very beginning, positioning herself not as a stepmother with rules and expectations, but as a confidant who understood his frustrations. She asked about his day when David forgot to, listened to his complaints about school and friends with patience that felt like validation. She defended him during arguments with his father, took his side when David enforced curfews or demanded better grades, and bought him things David said they couldn't afford: video games, new sneakers, a cell phone of his own that created a private channel of communication between them. "Your father doesn't understand you the way I do," she would tell him during late-night conversations when David had already fallen asleep. "You deserve more than this. I'm the only one who really sees you for who you are." This is how grooming works, and wherever you're watching from right now, drop your location in the comments below, because this story could happen anywhere, to anyone. It doesn't begin with physical contact or obvious abuse. It begins with emotional isolation, with a predator systematically separating their victim from other sources of support until only two people exist in their manufactured world. Angela exploited every abandonment wound Tyler carried, every insecurity about his absent mother, every teenage frustration with a father who seemed to demand perfection he could never achieve. She made him feel special, chosen, understood in ways that no 12-year-old should be understood by a grown woman. By the time Tyler turned 14, the relationship had crossed lines that should never be crossed, and Angela had found something even more valuable than a victim. She had found an accomplice. By early 2016, the household on Whitfield Street had become a theater of deception, where nothing was as it appeared. On the surface, the routines continued unchanged. David still left for work before dawn, still came home to dinner on the table, still believed he was building a life with a woman who loved him. Neighbors still waved from their porches, co-workers still asked about the family, and everyone who observed from the outside saw exactly what Angela wanted them to see: a devoted wife, a maturing stepson, a hard-working husband holding it all together. But underneath that carefully constructed image, a campaign was underway that would eventually cost David everything. Angela planted seeds of resentment in Tyler's mind with the precision of someone who had studied manipulation like a science. "Your father works so much because he doesn't want to be home with us," she whispered during their private moments. "He chose that job over you, over me, over everything we could have together." She reframed David's sacrifices as selfishness, his discipline as cruelty, his expectations as impossible standards designed to make Tyler feel like a failure. The years David had spent raising Tyler alone after his mother abandoned them? He had no choice. Your mother left him, and he was stuck with you. He resents you for it, even if he won't say it. Every truth became a lie in Angela's retelling, every act of love transformed into evidence of neglect. Tyler was 15 by then, his understanding of reality shaped almost entirely by the woman who shared his bed in secret and filled his ears with poison during the day. He had no baseline for healthy relationships, no outside perspective to challenge the narrative Angela constructed. His biological mother had abandoned him, so the idea that parents could betray their children was already normalized. His father was physically present, but emotionally unavailable in the ways that mattered to a teenager desperate for connection. And Angela was always there, always attentive, always ready to reinforce the story that would eventually make murder feel like mercy. "Imagine if he wasn't here," Angela said one evening, testing the water she had been poisoning for years. "Imagine what we could do, where we could go, how we could finally be together without hiding." Tyler listened, and somewhere inside him, something that should have resisted simply surrendered. The plan Angela devised was elegant in its cruelty, designed to exploit the inherent dangers of David's workplace while leaving no evidence of human involvement. No weapons that could be traced, no witnesses who might ask questions, no forensic evidence that would point anywhere except toward tragic industrial accident. David's job site was a distribution center on the outskirts of Savannah, 40,000 square feet of concrete floors, towering metal shelving units, and heavy machinery in constant motion. Forklifts carried pallets weighing hundreds of pounds through narrow aisles. Hydraulic lifts raised workers to dangerous heights. Loading platforms dropped 6 feet to the ground below without guardrails, and everyone who worked there understood that one wrong step, One moment of inattention could end a career or a life. OSHA had cited the facility twice in the previous 5 years for safety violations that management addressed with paperwork rather than meaningful change. Workers joked darkly about the risks, gallows humor that acknowledged what everyone already knew. Accidents happened here, and when they did, insurance companies paid settlements while the warehouse kept running. Angela recognized opportunity in that dangerous environment, a place where a fatal fall would generate sympathy rather than suspicion. In February 2017, she visited the warehouse twice under the pretense of bringing David lunch, walking the floor with him while her eyes cataloged every hazard with predatory attention. She found what she was looking for near the back of the facility, a hydraulic loading dock plate that was older than the others, slightly warped from years of heavy trucks and heavier loads. When delivery trucks backed up to the loading bay, the plate would extend outward, creating a bridge between the dock and the truck bed. Angela noticed that one of the hinge bolts was already loose, that oil had dripped onto the concrete nearby, that a stack of boxes sat positioned too close to the platform's edge. "This is where it happens," she whispered to Tyler that night, showing him photographs she had secretly taken on her phone. "One fall, one accident, and everything changes for us." Tyler had helped his father at the warehouse before, knew the layout, knew which entrances lacked cameras, knew how to blend in without attracting attention. Angela had chosen her accomplice well. Now she just needed him to say yes. The morning of March 14, 2017, began like any other workday in the life of a man who had no idea his family had sentenced him to death. David's alarm went off at 5:15 a.m., the same time it had rung for years, and he moved through his routine with the automatic motions of someone who had performed these rituals thousands of times before. Shower, shave, work boots laced tight, safety vest pulled over a faded t-shirt. He glanced into Tyler's bedroom before leaving, saw the shape of his son sleeping peacefully under tangled blankets, and felt the familiar warmth of fatherly love that had sustained him through every difficult year. Angela was still in bed, or so he thought, murmuring something that sounded like goodbye as he headed out the door at 5:45 a.m. What David didn't know was that Tyler had left the house 15 minutes earlier, slipping out the back door while his father was in the shower. The teenager moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward the warehouse, following a route he and Angela had planned together during whispered conversations that David never overheard. Tyler knew the facility's schedule because he had helped his father with weekend deliveries, knew which security cameras had blind spots, knew that the morning shift didn't start until 7, and the overnight skeleton crew rarely patrolled the loading area. He arrived at the warehouse at 5:52 a.m., his backpack containing a socket wrench borrowed from his father's own toolbox the night before. The hydraulic dock plate Angela had identified was exactly where she said it would be, the loose hinge bolt visible in the thin light filtering through the warehouse's high windows. Tyler's hands trembled as he loosened the bolt by 3 additional turns. Not enough to make the plate visibly unstable, but enough to ensure it would give way under a man's weight. He wiped hydraulic fluid from a nearby drum onto the concrete near the platform's edge, creating a slick spot that would look like routine industrial neglect. He shifted one heavy pallet forward by 3 inches, positioning it where a stumbling man's heel might catch. Then Tyler walked out the way he came, was home before 6:30 a.m., and climbed back into bed to wait. At 8:47 a.m., David stepped onto that dock plate, and his life as he knew it ended. The sound David's co-workers heard from 30 feet away would haunt their testimony for years afterward, a crack that seemed too loud to come from a human body, followed by a thud that echoed through the warehouse like a period at the end of a sentence. David had stepped onto the loading dock plate to guide an incoming delivery, a routine task he had performed hundreds of times without incident, when the plate shifted beneath his weight with a suddenness that left no time for reaction. His boot slipped on the hydraulic fluid he never saw, his heel caught on the pallet that shouldn't have been there, and he fell backward off the platform, dropping 6 feet before his spine struck the edge of a metal dolly positioned below. The ambulance arrived at 9:03 a.m., and paramedics found David conscious but unable to move anything below his waist. He kept asking for his wife, for his son, kept repeating through gritted teeth that someone needed to tell them he was okay. that he loved them, that they shouldn't worry. At Memorial Health University Medical Center, doctors confirmed what the paramedics had suspected from the moment they assessed his injuries: burst fracture of the T11 and T12 vertebrae, complete spinal cord damage, permanent paralysis from the waist down. David would never walk again. He would never work again. He would never stand on his own 2 feet again. The attending physician later testified that in over 2 decades of trauma surgery, he had rarely seen a patient receive catastrophic news with such grace, such acceptance, such concern for others rather than himself. Angela arrived at the hospital within an hour of the accident, tears streaming down her face as she clutched David's hand and promised to take care of him for as long as he needed. "We'll get through this together," she whispered, her performance so convincing that nurses later described her as the most devoted wife they had ever seen. Tyler stood in the corner of the hospital room, pale and silent, watching his father's broken body and processing the reality of what he had helped create. The plan had been to kill David for the insurance money. Instead, they had created something far more complicated. A victim who refused to die, trapped in a body that made him completely dependent on the people who had destroyed him. For the next 2 years, the house on Whitfield Street became a stage where Angela performed the role of devoted caregiver, while privately resenting every moment she spent maintaining the man she had tried to kill. To the outside world, she was a saint, the wife who had sacrificed her own comfort to care for a husband who couldn't dress himself, couldn't bathe himself, couldn't transfer from bed to wheelchair without assistance. She posted updates on Facebook about cherishing every moment and organized a GoFundMe campaign to help with mounting medical expenses, even though the workers' compensation settlement and negligence lawsuit against the warehouse had already provided nearly $1.2 million in combined payouts. Neighbors brought casseroles and sympathy. Church members organized prayer circles and offered to help with errands. And the local news even ran a brief segment about the inspiring couple, overcoming tragedy together. Angela accepted every kindness with gracious smiles and tearful gratitude, playing her part so convincingly that no one thought to question why a woman who seemed so devoted sometimes had eyes that looked through her husband rather than at him. She was incredible, a neighbor later recalled with the bitter hindsight of someone who had been completely fooled. "We all thought David was the luckiest man alive to have someone like her." But inside that house, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, a different reality was unfolding. Angela complained constantly to Tyler about the indignity of caregiving, the endless tasks that made her feel like a servant rather than a wife. "This isn't what I signed up for," she told him during their continued secret encounters, her resentment growing with every diaper change, every medication schedule, every physical therapy session that reminded her David was still alive. "This isn't living. This is prison." Tyler was 17 by then, trapped between guilt for what he had done and the ongoing manipulation that told him his father deserved everything that had happened. If you've made it this far, drop a comment letting me know you're still here, because what Angela said next to Tyler would set in motion a plan that couldn't fail. "We need to finish what we started," she whispered one night, "and this time, there won't be any mistakes." By late 2018, Angela had consolidated control over nearly every aspect of David's financial life, positioning herself as the gatekeeper between a disabled man and the resources that should have provided his security. She had convinced him to let her manage all household finances, framing it as compassion rather than control. "You have enough to worry about, sweetheart," she would say with practiced tenderness. "Let me handle the bills so you can focus on getting stronger." David agreed because he trusted her, because he had no reason not to trust the woman who bathed him and fed him, and told him she loved him every single day. He never saw the bank statements that showed money draining from accounts faster than it should have, never questioned why the settlement funds seemed to evaporate despite Angela's assurances that everything was fine. But the money, substantial as it was, would not last forever. After attorney fees, medical equipment, home modifications, and the ongoing costs of caring for a quadriplegic patient, the total available was closer to $800,000, enough to last perhaps a decade if managed carefully. Angela was 36 years old, and she had no intention of spending another decade pushing a wheelchair. More importantly, the life insurance policy remained active, $1.2 million payable upon David's death, as long as that death appeared accidental. No medical examinations, no waiting periods, no questions asked. Just a grieving widow collecting what her husband would have wanted her to have. In January 2019, Angela's browser history began telling a story that investigators would later piece together with horrified fascination. Accidental death wheelchair. Beach drowning statistics. Jetty accidents, Florida. How do insurance companies investigate accidental death claims? She researched dangerous locations along the Gulf Coast, studying current patterns and drowning reports with the methodical attention of someone planning a vacation rather than a murder. The East Pass Jetty in Destin, Florida kept appearing in her searches, a granite boulder structure notorious for strong currents, slippery surfaces, and tourists who underestimated its dangers. "I found the perfect place," Angela told Tyler one evening, showing him photographs on her phone. "One push, that's all it takes, and then we're free forever." This time, there would be no survival. This time, she would make absolutely certain. In May 2019, Angela announced to friends, family, and anyone who would listen that she was planning a beach vacation to Destin, Florida, framing the trip as a gift to the husband who had suffered so much and deserved to experience joy again. "He's been through hell," she told neighbors with practiced emotion in her voice. "I want him to feel the sand between his fingers, smell the salt air, watch the sunset over the Gulf. He deserves that much after everything." She posted about the upcoming trip on social media for weeks beforehand. Photographs of the wheelchair-accessible rental condo she had booked, screenshots of the weather forecast promising sunny skies, enthusiastic captions about family bonding time, and making memories that will last forever. The condo she selected was in a complex specifically designed for guests with mobility challenges, featuring roll-in showers, widened doorways, and ramps that would allow David to access the beach without assistance. Angela made sure everyone knew about these details, building a narrative of thoughtfulness and devotion that would later make her performance of grief seem entirely believable. "She thought of everything," a coworker recalled. "She was so excited to give him this experience. We all thought it was the sweetest thing we'd ever seen." David himself was overwhelmed with gratitude when Angela presented the trip as a surprise. Since his injury 2 years earlier, his world had shrunk to the dimensions of their home, the same walls every day, the same view from the same window, the same routine of medications and therapy sessions and hours spent in a wheelchair that had become both his prison and his only means of movement. The idea of seeing the ocean again, of feeling warm sun on his face and hearing waves crash against the shore, filled him with an emotion he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. "You didn't have to do this," he told Angela, his eyes wet with tears. "I know I'm not easy to take care of, but you've never given up on me." She held his hand and smiled. "That's what family does," she said. But underneath every carefully chosen word, every loving gesture, every suitcase packed for the trip, was a murder waiting to happen. June 12th and 13th, 2019, were choreographed with the precision of a theatrical production. Every public appearance designed to establish Angela and Tyler as devoted family members, creating beautiful memories with a disabled husband and father. They went to a waterfront seafood restaurant on the harbor their first evening, where Angela asked their waitress to take multiple photographs of the three of them smiling over plates of fried shrimp and hush puppies. "Our first family vacation in years," she explained to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying across nearby tables to maximize the number of witnesses who would later remember the happy family celebrating together. The following day, they visited souvenir shops along the tourist strip, where Angela purchased matching t-shirts with Destin 2019 printed across the front in cheerful letters. She insisted they all wear the shirts for another round of photographs, David in his wheelchair flanked by his wife and stepson, everyone smiling as if the future held nothing but promise. That afternoon, they spent hours at the condo's accessible pool, where other guests commented on how attentive Angela seemed, how patient she was with the wheelchair, how lucky David was to have someone so clearly devoted to his happiness. She never left his side, one vacationer recalled to investigators weeks later. She was constantly adjusting his umbrella, bringing him drinks, asking if he was comfortable. On the evening of June 13th, Angela mentioned casually to the condo's front desk manager that they were planning to visit the East Pass jetty the following morning. "My husband has always loved rock formations," she said, already constructing the explanation that would be needed afterward. The manager cautioned her about the jetty's dangers, the uneven surface, the powerful currents, the complete lack of accessibility for wheelchairs. Angela thanked him for his concern with a smile that revealed nothing. That night, after David had fallen asleep in the condo's accessible bedroom, Angela sat with Tyler on the balcony overlooking the dark Gulf waters. "Tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "Early, before the crowds arrive." The waves crashed against the shore below, the same water that would swallow David, before the sun reached its peak. "Once we get him to the edge, you unlock the brakes. I'll push. It'll be over in seconds." They woke before dawn on June 14th, 2019, Angela rousing David with gentle words about wanting to catch the sunrise from the jetty, framing it as a romantic gesture rather than the execution of a 2-year plan. "It'll be beautiful," she promised as she helped him dress in the dim light of the condo bedroom. "Just the three of us, watching the sun come up over the water. A memory we'll have forever." David was tired, his body aching from the previous day's activities. But he was willing because he was always willing when it came to making Angela happy. He had spent 2 years being grateful for her presence, 2 years believing that her patience and care were gifts he could never adequately repay. The drive from the condo to the East Pass took 8 minutes through empty streets, still dark with the last remnants of night. The parking lot was nearly deserted when they arrived at 6:15 a.m., just a few fishermen preparing their gear near the trailhead, and a jogger stretching against a wooden fence. Angela had chosen the timing deliberately, early enough that crowds wouldn't witness what happened, but late enough that first responders could be summoned quickly afterward. Tyler helped unload the wheelchair from the accessible van they had rented, his movements mechanical, his face carefully blank. The jetty itself stretched approximately 1,500 feet into the Gulf of Mexico, massive granite boulders stacked to form an uneven walkway that rose and fell with the natural contours of the rock. There was no paved path, no railings, no concessions to safety or accessibility. Spray from the waves kept the surfaces perpetually slick, and gaps between the boulders created hazards that even able-bodied visitors sometimes failed to navigate. At certain points along the structure, the drop to the churning water below exceeded 15 feet. Angela had scouted the location the previous afternoon while David napped at the condo, walking the jetty alone until she found the exact spot where she wanted to position him. They pushed the wheelchair slowly along the uneven terrain, Tyler helping navigate around the largest gaps, while Angela guided from behind. David laughed at the difficulty, grateful for the adventure. "This is amazing," he said. "Thank you for bringing me here." At approximately 6:47 a.m., they reached a spot near the midpoint of the jetty where the water below churned with visible currents and the rocks dropped sharply into the Gulf. Angela positioned the wheelchair so David faced the water, the rising sun casting golden light across waves that would soon become his grave. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, filling his lungs with salt air, feeling the spray on his face, experiencing a moment of pure peace that he believed his family had given him as a gift. He had no idea that Tyler was kneeling behind him, fingers finding the brake locks that kept the wheelchair stationary. He had no way of seeing Angela's hands tighten on the wheelchair handles, her knuckles whitening with anticipation. "It'll be over soon," Angela whispered, so softly that the sound barely carried above the crashing waves. And then they pushed. Investigators would later calculate that from the moment the wheelchair tipped over the edge to the moment it struck the water, only 4 seconds elapsed. 4 seconds of falling through empty air, of seeing sky become rock become sea, of understanding with terrible clarity exactly what was happening and exactly who had caused it. The wheelchair landed upside down between 2 granite boulders, the impact slamming David's head against stone before the water closed over him. He was still strapped in, the belts Angela had tightened that morning holding him in place as the wheelchair sank into 12 feet of churning current. David was conscious when he hit the water. The autopsy would later confirm this through evidence of active aspiration, proof that he was breathing, struggling, fighting to survive as seawater flooded his lungs. But he couldn't move his legs to kick, couldn't free his arms from straps designed to restrain him, couldn't push himself toward a surface that grew more distant with every passing second. The entire event, from the push to the moment his lungs filled completely, lasted approximately 37 seconds. 37 seconds of knowing that his own son had helped kill him. 37 seconds of understanding that every tender moment, every expression of gratitude, every whispered "I love you" had been a lie. 37 seconds, and then nothing at all. What happened in the moments after David disappeared beneath the waves was a masterclass in deception, a performance so convincing that even seasoned investigators initially accepted it without question. Angela ran toward the beach screaming, her voice carrying across the water to tourists who were just beginning their morning walks along the shore. She collapsed onto the sand, wailing with what appeared to be uncontrollable grief, clutching at her hair and calling David's name as if the sound of her voice could somehow bring him back. He fell. The chair rolled too fast. Somebody help him, please. Somebody help him. Tyler sprinted toward a family near the shoreline, tears streaming down his face, his voice breaking as he begged them to call 911. "My dad, he's in the water. The wheelchair went over. Please somebody do something." His performance was equally convincing. The terrified teenager who had just watched his father drown, the devoted son who had tried to grab the wheelchair but wasn't fast enough. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered around Angela and Tyler, strangers offering comfort and assistance to a grieving family whose tragedy had unfolded right before their eyes. A fisherman attempted to climb down the rocks to reach the spot where the wheelchair had entered the water, but was forced back by the powerful current. Another tourist dialed 911 at 6:53 a.m., reporting a drowning in progress at the East Pass jetty. A woman wrapped her jacket around Angela's shaking shoulders as she continued to sob, her face buried in her hands, her body heaving with apparent devastation. "It happened so fast," Angela kept repeating to anyone who would listen. "1 second he was there, and then the chair just rolled, and I couldn't stop it. I tried to grab it, but I couldn't stop it." Okaloosa County Sheriff's deputies arrived at 7:04 a.m. Coast Guard boats were in the water by 7:22 a.m. Divers descended into the churning Gulf at 7:41 a.m., searching for a man they already knew was almost certainly dead. Angela gave her first official statement at 7:58 a.m., her account detailed, consistent, and completely fabricated. She and Tyler held each other as they answered questions, the picture of a family destroyed by unimaginable tragedy. For 3 days, the search for David's body consumed the resources of multiple agencies, while Angela and Tyler waited with performed patience for the ocean to yield its evidence. Coast Guard vessels swept the area in systematic grid patterns, their crews scanning murky water where visibility rarely exceeded a few feet. Divers descended repeatedly into the churning depths near the jetty, fighting currents that pulled them sideways and clouds of sand that obscured everything beyond arm's length. Helicopters circled overhead, their thermal imaging equipment useless against Gulf waters that were nearly as warm as human body temperature. Angela used those 3 days to cement her status as the grieving widow, giving 2 additional interviews to local media outlets that covered the story as a cautionary tale about jetty safety. In one interview, she held up a framed wedding photograph, her fingers tracing David's face as she described him as the kindest man I've ever known, the best husband anyone could ask for. In another, she thanked the search teams through tears that seemed to fall on command, begging the ocean to bring him home so we can say goodbye properly. Tyler stayed mostly in the background during these public appearances, his silence interpreted by observers as traumatic shock rather than the guilt of someone who had helped commit murder. If this story is opening your eyes to how easily evil can hide behind a loving smile, share it with someone you care about, because awareness might be what saves them from trusting the wrong person. The local community rallied around Angela and Tyler with the kind of support that small towns provide in times of tragedy. The condo complex waived the remaining days of their reservation. A local restaurant provided free meals. Strangers sent flowers and cards expressing condolences for a loss they believed was accidental. On the afternoon of June 16th, with the search officially shifted from rescue to recovery, Angela and Tyler were allowed to return to Savannah. They drove home in near total silence, the Georgia state line passing beneath their tires like a threshold between the crime and its consequences. Somewhere around Tallahassee, Angela reached over and squeezed Tyler's hand. "We did it," she said quietly. At 4:47 p.m. on June 18th, 4 days after the murder, a commercial fishing vessel operating approximately 2 miles east of the jetty spotted something floating near the surface that the captain initially mistook for debris. From a distance, it looked like a cooler, or perhaps a piece of driftwood, the kind of ocean garbage that fishing crews encountered regularly in Gulf waters. But as the vessel drew closer, the captain recognized the shape for what it actually was: an overturned wheelchair, partially submerged, bobbing in the gentle swells with an almost peaceful rhythm that belied the violence of how it had arrived there. The captain radioed his discovery to the Coast Guard at 4:52 p.m., and within an hour, divers had descended to examine the area around the wheelchair. What they found confirmed the worst. David's body was lodged between 2 submerged boulders approximately 40 yards from where the chair had floated to the surface. He was face down, arms extended forward as if he had been reaching for something in his final moments, his body tumbled and battered by currents that had carried him far from the initial point of entry. The wheelchair itself told a story that didn't match the account Angela had provided to investigators. The brake locks were still engaged, but in the raised position, meaning the brakes had not been set at all when the chair went over. Standard wheelchair safety protocols required brakes to be locked whenever the chair was stationary, especially on uneven terrain. Why would a careful caregiver, a devoted wife who had spent 2 years attending to her disabled husband's every need, position him near a dangerous edge without engaging the most basic safety feature? The straps were another problem. They had been tightened far beyond what was necessary for normal use, threaded through reinforced loops and cinched until they left visible marks on the seat fabric. If David had been conscious when the wheelchair entered the water, and if the straps were as tight as they appeared, he would have had no possibility of freeing himself. None whatsoever. The ocean had returned David's body, and with it, questions that Angela had never anticipated. Dr. Catherine Hale had served as Okaloosa County's chief medical examiner for 11 years, and in that time, she had examined hundreds of drowning victims, each body telling its own story about the circumstances of death. Some drownings were clearly accidental, the evidence consistent with swimmers caught in unexpected currents or boaters who fell overboard without life jackets. Others bore the marks of suicide, weighted pockets, or deliberately chosen locations. And a rare few showed signs of something far more troubling: injuries and circumstances that suggested the victim had not entered the water voluntarily. David's body, recovered on June 18th and transported to Dr. Hale's examination table on June 19, 2019, told a story that contradicted almost everything Angela had claimed. The first inconsistency was the strap marks across his chest and waist, deep bruising that indicated the wheelchair belts had been tightened with deliberate force rather than standard caregiving practice. If David had been properly secured for his safety, the straps would have been snug but comfortable. These straps had been cinched like restraints, designed to prevent escape rather than provide support. The second inconsistency was the pattern of bruising on David's upper back. Dr. Hale identified 2 distinct areas of contusion, bilateral marks positioned exactly where someone's hands would grip if they were standing behind a wheelchair and pushing forward with significant force. The bruises were not consistent with the random impact of falling against rocks. They were consistent with human hands applying pressure in a coordinated motion. The third inconsistency was the absence of defensive wounds or any evidence that David had attempted to save himself. Drowning victims who are conscious when they enter the water typically show signs of struggle: skin under their fingernails from clawing at rocks, abrasions on their palms from trying to grip surfaces. David's hands were unmarked. His fingernails were clean. He had not fought to survive because the straps had made fighting impossible. Dr. Hale's preliminary finding was delivered to the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office on June 21st. Manner of death: undetermined, circumstances inconsistent with reported accident, further investigation recommended. The case was reopened the same day. Detective Rachel Vance had worked homicide investigations for the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office for 7 years, building a reputation for two qualities that her colleagues both admired and occasionally found exhausting: an almost obsessive attention to details that other investigators overlooked, and an absolute refusal to accept convenient explanations when evidence suggested something more complicated. When she received Dr. Hale's medical examiner report on June 21st, she didn't immediately suspect Angela and Tyler of murder. She simply suspected that something about the official narrative was wrong, and she intended to find out what. Her investigation began with re-interviewing every witness who had been present at or near the East Pass jetty on the morning of June 14th. Most of them confirmed what had already been established. They heard screaming, saw a woman running toward the beach, watched as a teenage boy pleaded for someone to call 911. The story seemed consistent, the grief seemed genuine, and none of them had witnessed the actual moment when the wheelchair went over. None of them, that is, except one. Howard Phelps was a retired electrician from Atlanta who had driven to Destin for a week of fishing in solitude. He had positioned himself on the jetty that morning around 6:30 a.m., setting up his gear near the midpoint where the water was deepest and the fish were most active. He remembered seeing the family arrive, remembered thinking it was unusual to bring a wheelchair onto such dangerous terrain, remembered minding his own business because other people's choices weren't his concern. He remembered hearing a splash, and he remembered something else that would prove crucial to the investigation. Before the screaming started, Phelps told Detective Vance during their interview, there was this moment of nothing, just silence. Maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10. And then the woman, she kind of straightened up, like she was composing herself, like she was getting ready for something. And then she started running and screaming. It was a small detail, easily dismissed, but it suggested something important. Angela's hysterical response had not been immediate. It had been calculated, prepared, performed after a brief pause to collect herself. Detective Vance's investigation transformed from suspicion into certainty on June 28, 2019, exactly 2 weeks after David's death, when a piece of evidence emerged that Angela had never anticipated and could never explain away. Vance had posted requests on local social media pages asking anyone who had been at the East Pass jetty on the morning of June 14th to contact her office with photographs or videos they might have captured. The response was modest at first, mostly sunrise shots and selfies that showed nothing relevant to the investigation. And then Michelle Torres called. Torres was a 34-year-old accountant from Birmingham who had been vacationing in Destin with her sister and their combined 4 children. On the morning of June 14th, she had walked her dog along the beach while the kids were still sleeping, enjoying the quiet before another chaotic day of sunscreen and sandcastles. At approximately 6:45 a.m., she had recorded a panoramic video of the sunrise, sweeping her phone slowly across the horizon to capture the full beauty of the moment. She hadn't thought about the video again until she saw Detective Vance's social media request and decided to review what she had captured. In the background of that sunrise video, visible for approximately 23 seconds before Torres's camera panned away, was the family on the jetty. The footage was distant, but clear enough to show a wheelchair positioned near the edge, a figure kneeling behind it, and another figure standing with hands on the handles. And then, unmistakably, the chair moved forward. Not rolled, not tipped accidentally, but pushed with deliberate force by the 2 people standing behind it. Detective Vance watched the footage 17 times before forwarding it to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's Forensic Video Unit for enhancement. The results, delivered 3 days later, were conclusive. The movement of the wheelchair was inconsistent with an accidental roll on uneven terrain. The angle of motion was too direct, the speed too sudden, the direction too deliberate. Someone had pushed that chair. And the enhanced footage showed exactly who. Angela and Tyler were no longer grieving family members. They were murder suspects. On July 2, 2019, Detective Vance obtained a warrant for all electronic devices associated with Angela and Tyler, including cell phones, laptops, tablets, and the family's shared home computer. What she found in the weeks that followed was nothing short of a roadmap to murder, evidence so comprehensive that it seemed almost impossible these killers had been careless enough to leave it behind. But arrogance has a way of making people sloppy, and Angela had been so certain of her own cleverness that she never bothered to delete the digital footprints that would eventually destroy her. The search history on Angela's personal laptop, recovered by forensic technicians, dated back to January 2019, and told a damning story in chronological order. Wheelchair accidents beaches. East Pass jetty drowning. How deep is water at Destin Jetty? Strong currents, Gulf of Mexico. Accidental death insurance payout timeline. Do police investigate drownings, Florida? Each search was a breadcrumb leading directly to the murder, each query evidence of premeditation that no defense attorney could explain away as coincidence or curiosity. The text messages between Angela and Tyler, recovered from a folder she thought she had permanently deleted, were even more devastating. March 3rd, 2019. We need to talk tonight, after he's asleep. April 14th. I found the perfect place. Look up East Pass Jetty. May 29th. 2 more weeks. Stay calm. Stay normal. June 13th, 10:47 p.m., the night before the murder. Tomorrow morning, 6:30. Don't hesitate. And then, at 7:14 a.m. on June 14th, just 21 minutes after the 911 call reporting David's drowning, it's done. Act sad. 2 words that captured the entire horror of what Angela and Tyler had done. Act sad. Not grieve, not mourn, not process the trauma of watching a husband and father die. Act, perform, pretend. The text message was an instruction, a reminder that everything happening on that beach was theater designed to deceive investigators, neighbors, and anyone else who might question whether a loving wife and devoted stepson could possibly have murdered the man who trusted them completely. As Detective Vance continued excavating the digital evidence from Angela's devices, she discovered something that expanded the scope of her investigation beyond anything she had initially imagined. The text messages between Angela and Tyler didn't begin in 2019 in the months leading up to David's drowning. They began in early 2017, in the weeks before a workplace accident that had left David paralyzed and wheelchair-bound for the rest of his shortened life. The Destin murder wasn't the first attempt on David's life. It was the second. February 12, 2017, 1 month before the warehouse accident. Angela to Tyler. I visited his job today. There's a spot near the loading bay that could work. Tyler's response. What do you mean work? Angela's reply. You know what I mean. We talked about this. February 28, 2017, 2 weeks before the fall. The plate is loose, oil on the floor. It'll look natural. And then, on March 14, 2017, the morning David's spine was shattered. Tyler to Angela. It's done. Angela's response. Come home. Don't talk to anyone. The implication was staggering, the kind of revelation that forced Detective Vance to reconceptualize everything she thought she understood about this case. The warehouse accident that had destroyed David's mobility wasn't an accident at all. It was a carefully planned murder attempt executed by a 16-year-old boy at the direction of his stepmother, designed to look like the kind of industrial mishap that happened regularly in dangerous work environments. The loose dock plate, the hydraulic fluid on the floor, the pallet positioned to catch a stumbling man's heel. None of it was coincidence or negligence. All of it was deliberate. This channel exists because of viewers like you, and if you want to support what we do while unlocking exclusive content, consider joining our YouTube membership to help us keep telling the stories that matter. The only reason the first attempt failed was because David survived the fall. He was supposed to die that day in March 2017. Instead, he became paralyzed, trapped in a wheelchair, completely dependent on the 2 people who had tried to kill him. And for 2 years, they had cared for him while planning how to finish what they started. Investigators had suspected from the beginning that the relationship between Angela and Tyler was inappropriate, that the intimacy of their communications suggested something beyond the normal bond between a stepmother and teenage stepson. But the full scope of Angela's predation only became clear when forensic technicians recovered a hidden folder on her phone containing photographs and messages that documented years of systematic abuse disguised as love. The images dated back to 2015, when Tyler was just 14 years old, a child by any legal or moral standard. They showed a relationship that had evolved from emotional manipulation into physical exploitation, captured in photographs that should never have existed, and messages that revealed how completely Angela had corrupted a vulnerable boy's understanding of right and wrong. She called him "my real partner" in text exchanges. She promised him a future where they would live openly together. She assured him that what they were doing was love, that the secrecy was temporary, that everything would be different once his father was gone. The messages also revealed how Angela had systematically dismantled Tyler's natural resistance to harming his own father. "Your father is the reason we can't be together," she wrote in one exchange from 2016. "He's holding us hostage in our own lives. Don't you want to be free?" In another, "This isn't murder. This is mercy. For him and for us." She had reframed patricide as liberation, convinced a teenager that killing his father was an act of love rather than betrayal, twisted his psychology so thoroughly that he participated in not one but 2 murder attempts against the man who had raised him. Child psychologists who later reviewed the evidence would testify that Tyler exhibited every classic sign of grooming victimization: isolation from peers, emotional dependency on his abuser, inability to recognize the relationship as exploitation, and participation in criminal acts to maintain the abuser's approval. Angela had taken a wounded child desperate for connection and transformed him into a weapon aimed at his own father. The law would eventually hold Tyler accountable for his actions, but the evidence made clear that he had been victimized long before he became a perpetrator. At 6:14 a.m. on July 8, 2019, 3 weeks after David's body was recovered from the Gulf of Mexico, Detective Rachel Vance led a team of deputies to the house on Whitfield Street in Savannah, where Angela and Tyler had returned to resume their lives as if nothing had happened. The neighborhood was quiet at that hour, most residents still sleeping or just beginning their morning routines, unaware that the modest home on their block was about to become a crime scene. Vance had coordinated with Chatham County authorities to make the arrests simultaneously, ensuring that neither suspect would have time to warn the other or destroy additional evidence. Angela was taken into custody in the kitchen, still wearing her bathrobe, a cup of coffee growing cold on the counter beside a stack of mail that included sympathy cards from neighbors who had no idea they were comforting a murderer. She offered no resistance, no protests of innocence, no demands to know why armed officers had entered her home. She simply stood and extended her wrists for the handcuffs with an expression that deputies described as eerily calm, as if she had been expecting this moment and had already made peace with its arrival. Tyler's arrest unfolded differently. Deputies found him in his bedroom, surrounded by the video game posters and scattered clothing of a seemingly normal teenager, his face registering shock that quickly dissolved into something that looked like relief. He began crying during the drive to the Chatham County Jail, not the tears of someone afraid of punishment, but the tears of someone finally confronting what he had done. "I'm sorry, Dad," he kept repeating, the words tumbling out between sobs. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." One deputy who witnessed the breakdown would later testify that Tyler said those 2 words more than 50 times during the 20-minute drive. Both suspects were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. Tyler, who had turned 18 just 3 months earlier, would be tried as an adult. The charges related to the 2017 warehouse incident would follow within days, adding attempted murder to the growing list of crimes that this mother and son had committed together. The interrogations began on the afternoon of July 8, 2019, conducted in separate rooms by Detective Vance and her partner, with the understanding that these 2 suspects would require fundamentally different approaches. Angela had shown no emotion during her arrest, suggesting a level of psychological control that would make breaking her difficult. Tyler had already begun crumbling, his guilt leaking through in ways that suggested he might be willing to tell the truth if handled correctly. Vance chose to interrogate Angela first, wanting to understand the mind of the woman who had orchestrated everything before confronting the boy she had manipulated into helping. Angela's interrogation was a study in calculated deflection. She answered questions with careful, measured responses that revealed nothing and admitted less. She denied any involvement in David's death, expressed shock that anyone could suspect her of harming the husband she had devoted her life to caring for, and maintained an expression of wounded innocence that never wavered. When confronted with the text messages recovered from her phone, she claimed they were taken out of context, innocent communications misinterpreted by investigators looking for evidence that didn't exist. When shown the enhanced video from the jetty, she insisted the angle was misleading, that what looked like a push was actually a desperate attempt to grab the wheelchair before it rolled away. Tyler's interrogation began the following morning after a sleepless night in a holding cell, and the contrast could not have been more stark. He maintained Angela's script for approximately 4 hours, denying everything, claiming the death was accidental, insisting he had loved his father and would never hurt him. But Detective Vance had prepared for this moment with patience and precision. She showed him a photograph of David taken at the hospital after the warehouse accident, the image of a man smiling through pain, giving a thumbs up to the camera, a get-well card from co-workers visible on the bedside table. Tyler stared at that photograph for nearly 3 minutes without speaking. Then something broke inside him, some wall that had been holding back the truth, and the confession began. Over the next 4 hours, he admitted to everything: the 2017 accident, the Destin murder, and the years of manipulation that had convinced him his father deserved to die. The trial began in March 2020, delayed by the early chaos of the COVID-19 pandemic, and moved to Chatham County Superior Court because the 2017 warehouse incident had occurred within that jurisdiction. Assistant District Attorney Michael Thornton led the prosecution, presenting a case built on 3 pillars that left virtually no room for reasonable doubt: the digital evidence recovered from Angela's devices, the forensic findings from Dr. Hale's autopsy, and Tyler's detailed confession describing both murder attempts in horrifying specificity. The defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task, trying to create uncertainty in the minds of jurors who had already seen text messages saying, "It's done. Act sad." Angela maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, testifying in her own defense with the same controlled composure she had displayed since her arrest. She presented herself as a victim of circumstance, a devoted wife falsely accused by a disturbed stepson who had developed an unhealthy obsession with her and was now lying to shift blame for crimes he had committed alone. Her attorney argued that Tyler was the true mastermind, that he had manipulated Angela rather than the other way around, that the text messages proved nothing except that she had known about his plans without being able to stop them. The jury did not believe her. The digital evidence was too comprehensive, the timeline too clear, the pattern of manipulation too obviously flowing from adult to child rather than child to adult. Tyler's confession had included details that only someone present during the planning could have known. Details that matched Angela's search history and text messages with damning precision. The video from the jetty showed 2 figures pushing the wheelchair, not one. The insurance policy had Angela's name as sole beneficiary, not Tyler's. After a trial that lasted 3 weeks and generated national media coverage, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. Angela showed no reaction when the verdict was read, her face as blank as it had been throughout the proceedings. Tyler wept openly, his shoulders shaking, his hands covering his face as the word guilty was repeated for each charge. The sentencing hearing took place on October 14, 2020, in a courtroom filled with family members, journalists, and observers who had followed the case since David's body was recovered from the Gulf more than a year earlier. Judge Patricia Harmon presided, and her words when delivering the sentences would be quoted in legal discussions and true crime coverage for years afterward, a judicial statement about the nature of betrayal and the limits of mercy. Angela received life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 20 years for the insurance fraud charges that would run consecutively in the event any appeals court ever overturned the murder conviction. "You exploited a child," Judge Harmon told her, her voice steady with controlled anger. You destroyed a family, and you murdered a man who loved you, not once but twice. The first time you failed. The second time you succeeded, and you showed no remorse for either. Angela stared straight ahead as the sentence was pronounced, her expression unchanging, offering no words in her own defense or acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Tyler's sentencing required the court to balance accountability with recognition of his own victimization. He received life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, the judge citing his age at the time of the first offense and the documented history of grooming as mitigating factors that reduced but did not eliminate his culpability. You were manipulated by an adult predator, Judge Harmon acknowledged, but you were also old enough to understand that what you were doing was wrong. You made choices, and those choices ended your father's life. David's sister spoke during the victim impact portion of the hearing, her voice trembling, but never breaking. My brother raised his son alone. He gave that boy everything, his time, his money, his heart. And in return, that boy helped kill him. I don't know how to make sense of that. I don't think I ever will. She paused, looking directly at Tyler across the courtroom. I hope you spend every day of your sentence thinking about what you did. And I hope somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, your father has found the peace he never got here. This case demands more than the recitation of facts and verdicts, more than the chronological telling of how one man's trust was exploited until it killed him. It demands that we sit with uncomfortable questions about the nature of family, the vulnerabilities we accept when we love someone, and the terrifying possibility that the people closest to us might not be who we believe them to be. These are not easy questions, and the answers they suggest are not comforting, but they are necessary if we want to learn anything from David's death beyond the simple tragedy of its occurrence. Consider the grooming that made this murder possible. Angela spent years dismantling Tyler's moral compass, replacing his natural love for his father with manufactured resentment that eventually made patricide feel like liberation. She didn't accomplish this through force or obvious coercion. She did it through attention, through validation, through making a lonely teenager feel seen and understood in ways that his exhausted single father couldn't match. By the time she asked Tyler to help kill David, she had already convinced him that David was the obstacle to their happiness, the burden holding them back from the life they deserved together. Consider the isolation that left David defenseless. His disability made him physically unable to escape, financially dependent on his abuser, and socially cut off from anyone who might have recognized the danger. Angela controlled his access to the outside world, managed his finances, determined who visited and when. She was simultaneously his caregiver and his killer, the person responsible for keeping him alive, and the person planning his death. He interpreted her patience as devotion, her attention as love. He had no way of knowing that every meal she prepared and every medication she administered was simply maintenance, keeping him functional until the next opportunity to finish what she had started. These patterns repeat in cases of elder abuse, spousal abuse, and caregiver exploitation across the country. David's story is extreme, but the vulnerabilities it exposed are common, present in countless homes where disabled or elderly individuals depend entirely on family members whose intentions may not be what they appear. Beyond the individual evil of Angela and Tyler, this case exposes failures in systems designed to protect vulnerable people, failures that created opportunities for abuse to flourish undetected until it was far too late. These institutional shortcomings didn't cause David's death, but they removed safeguards that might have prevented it, leaving a disabled man alone with the people who wanted him dead. When David's first wife lost custody of Tyler due to her addiction, no follow-up services were provided to assess the child's emotional well-being or offer therapeutic support for the abandonment trauma he had experienced. Tyler was simply transferred to his father's care, carrying psychological wounds that would later make him vulnerable to Angela's manipulation. A single intervention during those critical years, a counselor who recognized the warning signs, a support system that extended beyond one exhausted single father, might have given Tyler the resilience to resist when Angela began her campaign of corruption. When the warehouse accident occurred in 2017, investigators accepted the industrial fall explanation without examining whether the circumstances warranted closer scrutiny. No one interviewed Tyler about his access to the facility that morning. No one questioned why a teenager had been present in a restricted area before operating hours. The case was closed as an accident, the workers' compensation claim paid, and David was sent home to recover in the care of the same people who had caused his injuries. When David became disabled, he was discharged from the hospital with minimal support services beyond what his insurance would cover. There was no independent caseworker assigned to check on his welfare, no regular visits from social workers trained to recognize signs of caregiver abuse. Angela became his sole point of contact with the world, managing his medications, his finances, his communications, and his access to anyone who might have noticed that something was wrong. How many other vulnerable people are trapped right now in similar circumstances, dependent on caregivers whose intentions are not what they appear, isolated from systems that might protect them if only someone thought to look? The answer is more than any of us want to believe. Sociologist Evan Stark coined the term coercive control to describe a pattern of behavior that seeks to strip victims of their liberty and autonomy, degrading their sense of self until they become prisoners in their own lives. The concept typically applies to intimate partner violence, but this case presents a disturbing variation. Two victims of coercive control, one of whom was transformed into a perpetrator by the very abuse that victimized him. David experienced coercive control in its most literal form. His disability made him physically incapable of leaving, financially dependent on his abuser, and socially isolated from anyone who might have recognized his danger. Angela controlled every aspect of his existence. When he ate, when he slept, what medications he received, who was allowed to visit. She presented herself as his protector while secretly planning his death. A cognitive dissonance that David had no way of recognizing because his entire understanding of his circumstances came filtered through her carefully constructed narrative. Tyler experienced a different but equally devastating form of control. Angela isolated him emotionally from his father, from peers who might have questioned the relationship, from any source of moral guidance that might have competed with her influence. She created a world where only two people existed, and only her interpretation of events mattered. She convinced him that their relationship was love, that secrecy was necessary, that his father's death would be an act of liberation rather than murder. By the time Tyler participated in the 2017 attack, his ability to distinguish right from wrong had been so corrupted that patricide felt like the reasonable option. This raises questions about culpability that the legal system struggled to answer. Tyler was both victim and perpetrator, exploited and exploiting, a weapon and the hand that fired it. The law ultimately held him accountable for his actions, while acknowledging the manipulation that shaped them. But the philosophical question remains: at what point does victimization cease to mitigate responsibility? Tyler was a child when the abuse began, a teenager when he first tried to kill his father, barely an adult when he succeeded. Where exactly should we draw the line? In the coverage of this case, in the headlines and the trial transcripts and the true crime discussions, David has often been reduced to a role: victim, the man in the wheelchair, the target of the conspiracy, the body recovered from the Gulf. But he was more than the circumstances of his death, more than the last desperate seconds of his life, and he deserves to be remembered for who he was, rather than simply what was done to him. David was a man who chose responsibility when walking away would have been easier. When his first marriage collapsed and his wife's addiction made her unfit to parent, he didn't retreat into self-pity or abandon his son to the foster system. He fought for custody, won despite a system that favored mothers, and spent years as a single father working 50-hour weeks while making sure Tyler never felt unloved or forgotten. He coached Little League on weekends when exhaustion told him to stay in bed. He helped with homework he barely understood because his son needed him to try. David was a man who chose hope after catastrophic loss. When the 2017 accident destroyed his ability to walk, to work, to live independently, he didn't surrender to despair. He went to physical therapy. He learned to navigate his new limitations with patience that amazed his doctors. He found things to be grateful for, small pleasures that others might overlook, but that meant everything to a man whose world had shrunk to the dimensions of a wheelchair. David was a man who chose trust even when trust proved fatal. He believed his wife loved him because she showed him care every day. He believed his son loved him because that was what fathers and sons were supposed to feel. He had no framework for understanding that the people bathing him and feeding him and telling him they loved him were counting down the days until they could collect his insurance money. His capacity for faith was both his greatest strength and his ultimate vulnerability. We will never know with certainty what passed through David's mind in those final 37 seconds, the brief eternity between the push and the moment his lungs filled completely with seawater. The dead keep their last thoughts private, taking them into whatever comes next while leaving the living to imagine and wonder. But the evidence allows us to reconstruct, with terrible clarity, what David almost certainly understood as he fell. The push came from behind, sudden and forceful, the wheelchair tipping forward with a violence that no accidental roll could have produced. For a fraction of a second, perhaps less, David might have believed it was a mistake, a wheel catching on rock, an unfortunate stumble that Angela or Tyler would correct before anything terrible happened. But then he would have felt the sustained pressure of hands on the wheelchair handles, the deliberate direction of the fall toward the water below, and in that moment, understanding would have flooded his consciousness with the force of the waves about to swallow him. They had done this. His wife and his son, the two people he had trusted completely, had loved unconditionally, had thanked every day for caring for him through his disability. They had pushed him. They wanted him dead. And as the rocks rushed toward him and the water waited to receive his body, David would have realized something even more horrifying. This wasn't the first time. The warehouse accident that had stolen his legs, the fall that he had accepted as tragic misfortune, had been their work too. He had spent 2 years being grateful to the people who had crippled him, 2 years thanking them for care they provided only to keep him alive until they could try again. 37 seconds is not long enough to process such betrayal, not long enough to grieve what he had lost or rage against what had been done to him. 37 seconds gave David only enough time to know the truth before the truth no longer mattered. He died with that knowledge, the final thought of a man who had loved too much and trusted too completely. Justice is an imperfect concept, particularly in cases where the harm done can never truly be undone, and the people responsible can never fully comprehend the magnitude of their crimes. David is still dead. His sister will still grieve. The years he should have lived, the experiences he should have had, the future that was stolen from him cannot be restored by any verdict or sentence, no matter how severe. What the legal system can offer is accountability, a formal recognition that what was done was wrong, and that those who did it will face consequences proportional to their actions. Angela will die in prison unless she lives long enough for appeals that have already failed twice to somehow succeed on a third or fourth attempt. She will never hold another husband's hand, never manipulate another teenage boy, never collect another insurance payout from a man she murdered. The walls of her cell will be the boundaries of her world for every remaining day of her life, a fitting punishment for someone who made her husband's world so small before she ended it entirely. Tyler will be eligible for parole in 2049, when he will be 48 years old, roughly the same age his father was when he died. Whether he receives parole will depend on assessments of his rehabilitation, his remorse, his understanding of what he did and why it was wrong. The boy who helped kill his father will become a middle-aged man, still trying to make sense of choices he made as a manipulated teenager, still carrying the weight of blood that can never be washed away. Some will argue that Tyler's sentence was too lenient, that participation in murder should carry consequences more severe, regardless of the manipulation that preceded it. Others will argue that he was as much a victim as David, a child corrupted by an adult predator who bears primary responsibility for everything that happened. The truth likely exists somewhere between these positions, in the uncomfortable space where victimization and culpability overlap without fully canceling each other out. Tyler did terrible things. Tyler was also terribly damaged. Both statements are true. This documentary has presented the facts as they were established through investigation, trial testimony, and court records. But there are questions that remain unanswered, shadows in the narrative that may never be fully illuminated no matter how many times we examine the evidence. These uncertainties don't change the fundamental truth of what happened, but they remind us that complete understanding is often impossible in cases where the key witnesses have every reason to lie. Did Tyler ever genuinely love his father, or had Angela's corruption erased that capacity before it could fully form? In his prison interviews, Tyler speaks of regret that appears sincere, memories of fishing trips and little league games that seem to cause him genuine pain. But trauma and manipulation have a way of rewriting memory, and it's impossible to know whether Tyler's current remorse reflects his actual feelings or simply the narrative he needs to believe in order to survive his sentence. The boy who helped push that wheelchair into the Gulf may have loved his father. He may have hated him. He may have felt nothing at all. Did Angela feel anything when she watched David drown? She performed grief convincingly enough to fool investigators, neighbors, and journalists in the days following the murder. But performance isn't emotion, and the evidence suggests that Angela's tears were as calculated as everything else she did. Behind those tears, in the private spaces of her mind where no one else could see, was there satisfaction at finally completing a plan 2 years in the making? Relief that the burden of caregiving was over? Or simply nothing, the hollow emptiness of someone incapable of experiencing the emotions she mimicked so effectively? Were there warning signs that others missed? Opportunities for intervention that might have changed the outcome? The investigation revealed no concrete evidence that anyone suspected what was happening inside the house on Whitfield Street. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Someone might have noticed something, might have spoken up, might have asked questions that could have saved David's life. If so, they have remained silent, carrying their own burden of what-ifs and if-onlys. This is not a story about perfect victims or obvious monsters. It's a story about ordinary people, a single father trying his best, a woman who wanted more than she had, a teenager desperate for identity and acceptance, whose lives intersected in ways that produced catastrophic results. The horror of what happened to David lies precisely in its ordinariness, in how easily the circumstances that enabled his murder could exist in countless other homes where disability creates dependency, and dependency creates opportunity for exploitation. It's a story about vulnerability and the people who recognize it as weakness to be exploited, rather than humanity to be protected. David's disability didn't just limit his mobility. It limited his options, his access to information, his ability to recognize danger and respond to it. He was trapped in a body that required care from the same people who wished him dead, forced to trust them because trust was his only option. Every day he spent in that wheelchair, thanking Angela for her patience and Tyler for his help, was another day closer to the murder they were planning. It's a story about grooming and its capacity to corrupt. Angela didn't simply seduce Tyler. She dismantled his moral compass, piece by piece, replacing love for his father with manufactured resentment, replacing natural resistance to violence with normalized acceptance of murder as a solution to problems. By the time she asked Tyler to help kill David, she had already remade him in her image, a weapon designed to destroy the man who had raised him. And it's a story about trust, the most dangerous gift we give to the people we love. David trusted Angela with his finances, his care, his life. He trusted Tyler with a father's unconditional devotion. That trust was not just undeserved. It was actively weaponized against him, exploited at every turn, used to isolate him from help, and keep him vulnerable until the moment they pushed his wheelchair into the Gulf. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories like this one.